Hi, it's Emily Freitag, and I'm joined today by Rebecca Kockler, the former Assistant Secretary of Education for the state of Louisiana. And Rebecca has pioneered some incredible work on many fronts around state policy, state implementation, is very well versed in all the academic disciplines, but we are going to spend today talking particularly about literacy. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here, as always.
So as we start all of these conversations, we'd love to hear, all of us would love to hear a story from your journey as a learner and what that has taught you about learning.
I have been thinking about this story because I've been thinking so much about early reading and writing lately, especially as we head back to school in this particular environment, because I think how our youngest learners learn to read and write in this environment is particularly complex, and for good reason, has a lot of people feeling some anxiety. And I remember, I have a very distinct memory from kindergarten when I was learning to read with Sister Bennett at my small Catholic school in rural Minnesota. And I remember a friend of mine who actually, we grew up through high school together and were friends for a long time. He still lives in St. Cloud, actually, John Matthews, and sort of such a funny small world. But we were sitting on the rug in kindergarten, and we were learning to read, and it was a reading block, and we were doing independent reading, and we had picked books out of the library. And I tell this story because it's like one of my most distinctive memories from being a child. And I think it's such an interesting one because it actually explains so much about how early readers learn to read and the strengths of different early readers. And it's so weirdly profound to me in my work, given my focus on early reading and my obsession with the science of reading and what we know works and how kids need to learn how to read. But John and I were sitting on the floor mat, like pulling out books from the library, and our teacher, Sister Bennett, was an incredible kindergarten teacher and very, very strict and very stern. And from a really young age, I was sort of had all of my indignancy that I still hold today. And John and I were on the floor and we were arguing about a word we were trying to read together. We were like co-reading a book together. And John was saying that the word was the. And I was like, that is absolutely not the word. The word is not the. The word is taha. Like, it's taha. And he's like, no, it's not. It's the. I'm like, no, it's not. It's taha. Like, pronounce it. Like, look at it. T-H, like, E. It's taha. And he's like, well, what does taha mean? I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea what it means. And he's like, well, it's the. We had this like debate on the floor. And I was like, no, nope, absolutely not. You are wrong, John. And it's such an interest. And I actually remember a few days later, literally learning the TH blend and going back and being like, it was the, and he's like, I know. It's such a fascinating story because I think what it shows so much of is a reader like John who could actually just like, he learned in a particular way. Like he probably, frankly, memorized words very well, which is what lots of our early readers can do. Like John read a lot with his family. I read a ton with my family too. am not a super great, I don't memorize things well. And John does. And I memorize skills well. I can practice skills and do skills over and over again. And then I really succeed, but I'm not a memorizer. And John had memorized the word the. He knew that it was that. When he looked at it, he knew what it was. And I didn't memorize words easily or vocabulary easily. And once I was taught the skill of the TH blend, I actually went back and was like, oh my God, I was wrong. Crap. Like, I hate this. And I remember that moment so much, right? It's like fascinating to me that I remember learning to read. And I remember that argument with John Matthews on the floor, so many years ago. And to me, that memory sticks in my mind so much. I think about it all the time these days as I'm thinking about our early readers and our debates about how kids learn to read and the science of reading and all of these things. And I think like the reality is different learners are different. And we think the way, we may have learned or what worked for us, like maybe John thinks that you can just read a lot to kids and they'll learn because that really worked for him. I'm not saying he does. I'm not. belief to him. But I actually really was not a reader who learned that way. I did not learn through memorization of vocabulary. I read all the time. My parents read to me all the time. So it's just been a very like sort of profound memory for me lately, in particular, as I've been deep in the thinking of how do we transfer this, especially right now, like what most matters, and this instinct to be like, okay, let's just read a lot to kids while we're all out virtually. And I believe that we should obviously do that. And like, I believe so deeply in having to figure out how do we help kids learn the skills and the science of learning to actually like who's gonna
cracking the code. Yeah.
The TH blend so she can because she might not memorize it like the kid next to her will memorize it. So anyway, I've just been thinking a lot about differences in kids and like how kids learn to read and like why the deliberateness of how we teach matters, because some kids are sort of more lucky like John and some kids are less lucky like me, skills to be able to succeed. And so that particular experience I've just been like,
thank you for sharing that. That resonates too for me as a mom of a 4.5-year-old who is starting to like have the words he knows. Great. Well, take us in the series. We're exploring how we avoid the triple threat of inequity. It existed, it's worse, but how do we make sure that educator response to exacerbated inequity doesn't actually further it even more? And so to do that, we're exploring questions about what do we actually know works? What can we kind of hold on to? And then what are things that we try that we actually know don't work? So what can we avoid? Take us into what you are thinking about a lot these days, in particular with early reading.
Yeah. Well, I'm eager to dig in on a particular subject and even grade band, because I think there's like a lot of things that exacerbate inequity in our schools. And I'm going to talk about a few specific things that I think contribute to that in early reading. And I don't say those things because I think they're the only things that contribute to inequities in our schools. There's a lot of complexities in our systems that are very layered and deeper than just instructional priorities and whatnot. So I just obviously think that is such an important frame. But let's talk a little bit about early reading and why we have so many kids in America who show up to 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, not reading. It actually still truly astounds me that that's true in our country, because we actually know how to teach reading. Like we actually know the science of it. And so the fact that we have not yet figured out how to get every kid to read by 3rd grade, when actually other countries have, and frankly, poor countries have done it, is, sort of astounding to me. And I think there's a couple of different things happening. I think, first of all, in early literacy in particular, the instinct to teach how you learned something has like profound consequences on kids in early literacy in particular. Probably the math folks would argue with me like as much in math too, and I imagine that's true, but it is certainly true in early reading. And I think there is this sense that, and I think we have some sort of data that led us a little bit askew, not that the data itself was bad, but I think the Harvard study that showed like, well, kids come in into pre-K, if you're poor and you haven't been read to as frequently, you only have X number of words in your vocabulary, and that leads to sort of long-term effects in reading. And that data is true, and that data is helpful and informative, but that data is not instructive in some sort of way about what you do in a classroom with pre-K students or with kindergartners or with first graders. And I think, unfortunately, some of those data sets have led us to feel like the problem is poverty, or the problem is parents reading or not reading to their kids, or the problem is access to books. And those things have influence, absolutely no question. And we know we have so many examples of kids who have learned to read in a whole bunch of different settings, including that setting where kids may come in with less vocabulary and come in with less access to text. And so I think the question is, why don't we implement the science of what we know is necessary and how kids learn to read? There are really three components of it. There's the reading foundations element, which is very well researched and well established. There's reading comprehension, which is how you make sense of the things you read once you have the skills to actually read them. And there's writing. How do you talk about and communicate your reactions and responses to what you've just read? And what makes teaching in elementary school so hard is that the way you do those three things, which are sort of seen as the same, is actually really different. Like the way you teach reading foundations is really different from how you teach reading comprehension. And it's pretty different from how you actually teach writing. And that makes the teacher's jobs complex, because that's also in the same grades where teachers are teaching math and science and social. And really teaching reading is three subjects. Foundations, it's reading comprehension, and it's writing. And those things overlap and they interconnect, and there's so much interplay. But we haven't done a good job to separate those things. We haven't done a good job to train teachers on those three different elements clearly, and then support their instruction in that. And we could get into like details of a whole bunch of those elements, but I do just think the lack of systematic reading foundations and reading comprehension instruction in pre-K2, like no question has exacerbated inequity in our country. And where you see schools, teachers, school systems getting very clear and aggressive on those three things, you see reading results grow and improve. And Mississippi is a great example of that. So I just think we just aren't requiring that our system do at scale the things we know scientifically matter and work.
So let's, just to make this so real, let's pick one of the three. Maybe we could go for foundations, given that your story started there as well. And so recognizing just the complexity of the system and the incoherence of it, what, if you're a teacher, if you're a leader, and you are starting this school year in whatever format, worried about the unfinished learning during a disrupted spring, what do we know works?
Yeah. So again, we're just on reading foundations, which I know you've said, but I just want to reiterate, because the way to think about this in reading comprehension is so different, and where the job becomes so complex in early reading. But we do know that there are some core elements of reading foundations, and they do happen when we're within the K2 band. We know less about how to teach like an 8th grader who's missing reading foundations. We're less clear about how much to remediate in order to remediate. Like, we actually have some research to do there. But we know if you just teach them in the sequence, the 8th grader will learn it too. But we think probably they could do it faster. And
there's a more targeted way.
Yeah,
maybe.
Exactly. But in K2 or pre-K2, we definitely know that there is an order of teaching the reading foundations that is systematic. And, you know, Tim Shanahan writes about this a lot and has reviewed so much of the research around this. I think his blog is the most helpful on a lot of it, actually. We know that when every single student in a class is taught systemic foundations or systematic foundations in a very deliberate sequence and order that is well researched, more students are likely to end that year reading on grade level. So that I think is a little bit hard for people to grasp, because especially in early reading, we are obsessed with this idea of like meeting every kid where they're at. And so what that tends to lead to, because we're not as clear on that exact scope and sequence and order of reading foundations, we then sort of default to Lexile level or reading level or whatnot. And so what meeting students where they're at tends to mean in early grades is find their Lexile level or their reading level and practice skills with them in any sort of order on that reading level, and then help them move up to the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. And like, all of the research shows us that actually doesn't work. That isn't the thing we need to meet at their grade level. It's not the Lexile level. It's figuring out in the scope and sequence of skills and reading foundations where are they at in that scope and sequence? And then how do we meet them
And
there?
just to make that concrete, that's like recognize a short A, understand the TH blend. Like, can you give us a couple examples of that and what would come first, next, last?
Yeah,
Or early?
yeah. So some of the blending sounds, for example, are really early. So being able to just make the sounds of words so that you can actually say the words, like decode the words and say them. So for example, the example that I gave earlier, I knew what the was. I knew what it meant in a sentence. If I could have decoded it and said the, I would have been able to read the sentence. Instead,
and made sense of it, actually, right? Yeah.
Instead, I read it as "tuh" because I did not have the skill to blend the T and the H together. I had learned, and I thought it was appropriate actually at where I was. I was in kindergarten. Like, it wasn't like an inappropriate place for me to be, but it's a great illustrative example, right? I had learned appropriately first each individual sound. The A makes the sound, the T makes a T sound, the H makes a H sound, the E makes a sound. So I said T-H, like that appropriately.
Totally logical. Yeah.
Individual sounds. So once you get through individual sounds, then you start getting to all the blends in the English language so that you can start blending the letters appropriately. We're not like Spanish, actually. Spanish is much easier in this way, right?
German.
Yeah. Blend a whole, and then the word is totally different to ha. So once I was taught the next thing after each individual, I was taught to blend, which is part of decoding and reading foundations. I could then read the sentence and say the. And I then wasn't tripped up by saying, like, you know, with my friend John, who's arguing with me, like, well, what does it mean? And I'm like, I don't know what that means. I know it's like, I have no idea what the sentence means now because I can't it because I don't have the skill of the TH blend. And that was an appropriate progression. Learn the individual sounds, learn the blending sounds, right? And that unlocked the meaning for me. That particular sentence, because that was the missing word for me in that sentence. It wasn't just the practice of reading over and over and over again. It wasn't, in this case, like background knowledge I was missing. It matters in complex places and more complex places in reading comprehension. But first, you just have to literally be able to read the words on the page and see how much meaning you can make out of the words on the page. And breaking apart the reading foundations into things like knowing the letter sounds and letters, then knowing the blending sounds so that you can make meaning words, you know, then knowing, you know, practicing fluency over time so you can actually do that faster over time. Like, those reading foundations position you for more complex reading comprehension. And when they're not taught, like, if someone had just jumped in and taught me the, like, TH blending without teaching me the individual letter sounds first, I would also be a very confused kid. Because every time I would see a T, I might wonder, like, well, where's the H? And what does the T sound like without the H? And like, why does not have an H? And it would have been very confusing to me. And so you have to learn them in a particular order, sense of how to read in a particular order. And those reading foundations are often not taught explicitly. So for example, the lexile level of the book doesn't matter. I'm sure the book I was reading was an incredibly low lexile level. What mattered was I able to practice the next skill I needed? And that is the sort of differentiation we need to be doing with reading foundations, is saying, where in this skill progression are our students? And that's a really important question for us right now, with having students having missed the spring and not knowing what students are going to get or not this fall. In this case, with reading foundations, you do need to check on with an assessment and say, there's a scope and sequence to reading foundations over the course of about 3 grade levels. Where does a student fall on that? And you need to start there, even if it is some from a previous grade level. You have to do that part of reading foundations. And that's a totally different approach than reading comprehension, where we don't need to be as linear and we don't need to do as much diagnosing. And again, that's what makes teaching reading complex, because you're two very different pedagogical approaches
within the same discipline.
Kid read Harry Potter, you know?
Yeah. Well, and we had a good conversation with Don Hirsch that, you know, delved deeply into knowledge and the role that plays in comprehension as well. So for anyone who wants to hear more about that, that's another good interview, quite relevant. So final question, what do we see people try with good intentions that we actually know doesn't work? You've touched on a few things. You've talked about leveled readers and just kind of placing based on that. What else do we know doesn't work? Particular to reading foundations. So going out of order, not having an order.
I think trying to do too much. So I think the balanced literacy approach was an approach at the policy level or the sort of think tanky level to say, let's just stop the arguments between the whole language people and between the reading foundations people, and we'll just do balanced literacy. We'll do a little bit of all of it. That is, I think, part of what is really both confusing teachers right now in our system and also taking away from the time necessary to teach the elements really well. And it's very confusing to say everything matters in teaching reading. Because then when anyone's prioritizing, which happens all the time in schools, people prioritize the thing they like, the thing that worked for them. You know, it's based on sort of gut and instinct and not as much on research and science. And so I think we need to stop doing that to our teachers. I think we need to be explicit with our teachers about what most matters. Reading comprehension is so essential. And if you don't have reading foundations, reading comprehension doesn't matter, you know? And reading foundations is like the ball game in early elementary, and reading foundations is reading comprehension matters, and starting to build background knowledge early matters too. So I don't want to undervalue that. It matters, but like you won't go anywhere as a reader without reading foundations. And we have to tell teachers that and say, you have to teach this explicitly. And, you know, I have this like example from my brother who runs a school. He runs a pre-K-6 school. He had just purchased a brand new curriculum, a really great curriculum that has like integrated reading foundations with reading comprehension and writing in it, et cetera. Retrained his teachers, super excited. They were like ready to roll. And I walk into a school and was doing a walkthrough, and he's like, oh, come down to the basement. I want to show you these like amazing things I just got in. And I'm like, okay, great. And we walk down, and like literally it's an entire basement full of leveled readers. And I was like, what are you, like, my heart was like breaking. I'm like, what are you going to do with, like, why'd you spend the money on these? I'm like, what are you going to do with them? And he's like, wait, what? I'm not supposed to do this? I'm like, no, this is like, goes against everything you're teaching in this other curriculum you're using. And he didn't really totally understand that and the confusion that teachers would feel from that. And what would be taken away if he had teachers trying to teach leveled readers and this very explicit reading foundations progression. And the fact that what would likely happen is teachers would abandon the reading progression because they would think that teaching all kids on this reading foundations progression isn't differentiated enough or isn't appropriate for kids. So we send mixed messages to teachers, and then we get frustrated that teachers aren't teaching reading foundations, when in actuality, we've been sending so many complicated mixed messages, like differentiate on Lexile, use these, but teacher reading progression to this, that's the same for every kid. Like those things don't reconcile really. And so I think at our systems level, that's one of the biggest mistakes we've made and why it makes the job of teachers in early elementary school so difficult. And I think that then leads to a whole bunch of just little things like classroom libraries that are leveled and telling kids they can read books on their grade level, which is just an absolutely unbelievable practice that is actually harms and gets in the way of kids' sort of natural instinct to pick books they like, to read books on topics that they like, to actually progress up grade level bands on their own naturally, because 10 books on frogs and they'll just kind of pick the book that's natural to them. So we have all of these little things that come from the confusion of balanced literacy that play out in really complicated and I would say harmful and damaging ways for kids in our classrooms that keep kids behind longer, in my opinion.
Oh, that story resonates so much. And I talk to so many leaders that come from such a good place of good intention. They just want their kids to learn how to read. And yet, you know, throw all the ideas at it without really ever feeling very confident in any of them or clear.
And my brother's like the best. Like I'm not the best. He's like an incredible principal. He's so passionate. He reads a million things and he's very confused. He's very legitimately confused.
Just Google reading frameworks and you'll understand the confusion in the world, right? Yeah. Okay, but we do know some things, and foundations actually feels like among the simpler things where we like the science is more conclusive than it is on so many of the other topics we've been exploring. And the answer is get a good systematic curriculum, train your teachers in it, and stick to it, and avoid anything else that pulls out of it.
Yeah, and I think what I'm about to say feels a little bit like heresy in our world these days, but again, like Tim Shanahan writes so eloquently on this with lots of research to back it up, but you will do better to not differentiate reading foundations in pre-K2 than you will to differentiate. And that feels so antithetical to what the whole world tells us right now in education, which is meet every kid where they are. It's all about differentiation. It's all about using the data. And our school systems and our teachers hear this all the time. And yet the data shows us over and over in reading foundations, in early elementary grades, when you're teaching reading foundations, you will do much better by more of your kids if all of them follow the same reading progression. Because think about my friend John. John could read the, great. John had an incredible memory. He could memorize that vocabulary word, awesome. He's not harmed by the lesson on the TH blend. John is doing just fine. Like, and I assure you,
because like when he gets to think, he may need it, right? Yeah.
Exactly, because maybe he didn't memorize think, exactly. Or maybe he has a crazy memory and memorized all the vocabulary words, who knows? But like, probably it'll help him. And it's not gonna set John back because John could read that and I couldn't read that and I needed more help on the TH blend. Like, we're good. And like, so I just think this idea of differentiation has been overdone and misguided. And, you know, the folks at Student Achievement Partners say this all the time, that leveled books lead to leveled lives. And I do think it is one of the just absolute contributors to the ongoing gap between reading levels in kids is this obsession to differentiate in the early grades, when all of the research tells us we will do better, even if it means teaching every kid the same thing, to teach a systematic reading foundations program to every child in America. Way more kids would read if we did that. Never differentiate 1 ounce. Now, if you can differentiate some within that reading foundations progression, great. But like, honestly, let's just teach everyone to do that first, and then we'll iterate from there. But we have a deep desire to over remediate, and we do this in math too. Actually, we actually don't need to. We do in math all the time. And so we have an instinct, and again, not for ill will, for the opposite of that, a desire to do what the system is telling them they think is the right thing. Meet kids where they are, give every kid what they uniquely need. And we, I think, as systems leaders and as policy people, send more unhelpful messages than helpful on these points. And I just think in reading foundations, it is really like dramatically influencing the ultimate success of our kids.
Rebecca Kockler, thank you so much for talking with us. I really enjoyed this conversation, and we look forward to continuing to learn together.
The work you're doing. Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks.